Welcome to this video presentation of NATO planning process. After this presentation, you should be able to summarize the two operations planning categories NATO uses, explain the North Atlantic Council's role in the operational planning process, explain the NATO Crisis Management Process methodology, explain the Joint Operational Planning Group's build-up and tasks, explain the Logistic Operational Planning Group and its connection to the Joint Operational Planning Group, and recall the NATO Force Generation process in general. Many of you will recall the famous quotation, "Plans are nothing, planning is everything," by US General and later President Dwight D. Eisenhower. For the record, the actual quotation was, "In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." If we look at the difference between the meaning of plans and planning in an easy way, we can say that plans are blueprints of desired goal achievements and specifies the necessary resource allocations, tasks, and other actions. Planning can be described as means to think or decide what to do and how to do it in advance. In order to prepare for and conduct complex and multidimensional operations, it is necessary to conduct operations planning, to develop appropriately detailed operational plans, which address all relevant factors for the efficient and successful conduct of an operation. NATO's operations planning sets out broadly the operations planning process to describe how the military supports the NATO Crisis Management Process. It describes how the alliance initiates, develops, coordinates, approves, executes, reviews, revises, and cancels operation plan. To prepare for its role and mission, the alliance has two main operations planning categories: advanced planning and crisis response planning. NATO has two operations planning categories: advanced planning, designed to prepare the alliance to deal with identified possible security risks. There are two types of advanced planning operations plans: standing defense plan and contingency plans. Common for these two types of plans are that they are pre-made before any crisis. Crisis response planning, developed in response to an actual or developing crisis. Crisis response planning calls for the development of an operation plan. For each operation, two operation plans are produced: a strategic operation plan approved by the NAC and an operational operation plan approved by SACURE. An operation plan is a detailed and comprehensive plan capable of execution as soon as the forces are assigned in accordance with the combined joint statement of requirements and the concept of operations. This slide contains the detailed definitions or descriptions of concept of operations and the different plans from the previous slide. The North Atlantic Council, often referred to as the Council, has the ultimate authority in NATO and is the only body within the alliance which derives its authority explicitly from the North Atlantic Treaty. Decisions are made on consensus only. The North Atlantic Council will decide for each relevant crisis if NATO should act and, if so, in what manner. While every crisis is unique, the NATO Crisis Management Process is the process by which the alliance addresses and, subject to decisions by the North Atlantic Council, aims to manage and resolve a crisis. Clearly, each circumstance will dictate the exact steps, but the NATO Crisis Management Process provides a default template from which deviations may be made by informed decisions. It is primarily designed to allow the relevant staffs and NATO committees to coordinate their work and to submit comprehensive advice to the North Atlantic Council in a timely and compelling way. Strategic, operational, and tactical are the three levels utilized by NATO to categorize echelons of command and operations activities. The NATO Strategic Commander for Operations is Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR. The commander at the operational level is normally the Joint Force Commander at one of NATO's Joint Force headquarters. The commanders of the NATO command structure, maritime, land, and air commands will provide single service command at the operational level. A Special Operations Component Command or the Specified Component Commands may also be established. Other flag officers from the NATO force structure may be designated as the Joint Force Commander for Operations, where a Graduated Readiness Forces headquarters is utilized. Commanders at the tactical level are the functional commanders. The Alliance will daily be monitoring and maintaining situational awareness across its area of interest. The NATO Crisis Management Process is initiated once indications suggest that there is an emerging crisis that may affect NATO's interests. NATO Crisis Management Process consists of 6 successive phases that generally confirm with the cycle of crisis. Phase 1, indications and warning of the potential or actual crisis. Phase 2, assessment of the developing or reassessment of an ongoing crisis and of its potential or actual implications for alliance security. Phase 3, development of recommended response options to support the North Atlantic Council decision-making throughout the cycle of crisis. Phase 4, planning. Phase 5, execution of the North Atlantic Council decisions and directives. And Phase 6, transition and termination of NATO's crisis management. Progression throughout each phase is not automatic and will be guided by the North Atlantic Council decision-making. The phases may overlap and they may be repeated depending on the changing circumstances during the life cycle of a crisis, as depicted on the slide. Planning and operation throughout the NATO Crisis Management Process is called NATO Crisis Response Planning and conducted simultaneously at all 4 levels. The North Atlantic Council and Military Committee, SHAPE, Joint Headquarters, and Component Headquarters. In the NATO Crisis Response Planning, planning at military strategic level and operational level is called the operational planning process. The purpose of the operational planning process is to prepare the alliance to meet any future possible crisis. The operational planning process also provides for the timely and efficient development of operation plans in response to an actual or developing crisis. Throughout the planning process, the operational planning process must continuously consider the expanding internal NATO civil-military interface available for use within the operations planning. In line with NATO policy and the planning principles, military planners will integrate civil emergency planning experts as well as licensed personnel from relevant NATO agencies and non-NATO organizations when authorized into the appropriate steps of the operational planning process. NATO's civil emergency planning experts are responsible for providing advice and support to their military counterparts during all phases of the planning process. The NATO Crisis Management Process at the political level and the operational planning process at the strategic level both requires adequate response from the operational level. The flow of information, direction, orders, other planning inputs, advice, assessment, and reports is depicted in the figure. On this slide, we have tried to illustrate how the operational planning process is distributed around the 6 phases in the NATO Crisis Management Process. The operational planning process is normally conducted by one of NATO's 2 joint headquarters. On the next slide, we will focus on the engine in the operational planning process, called the Joint Operational Planning Group. The Joint Operational Planning Group will normally be activated in Phase 2 and be composed of representatives from all branches, included augmented representatives and subject matter experts when needed. Each branch has at least one representative present in the Joint Operational Planning Group. The different branches' representatives will therefore be supported by own sub-planning groups. From the logistic branch perspective, it is recommended, if possible, to have one general logistic representative supported by one movement and one medic expert, all present in the Joint Operational Planning Group. The Logistic Sub-Planning Group is called Logistic Operational Planning Group and consists of logistic representatives from all logistic functional areas: supply, material, life cycle support, equipment and maintenance, movement and transportation, services, medical. The Logistic Operational Planning Group task is to provide input to the logistic representatives in the Joint Operational Planning Group. Military logistics has several principles: foresight, economy, simplicity, cooperation, and flexibility, which are enshrined in NATO and national doctrine. In order to support the planning staff, the logistic considerations must be considered at each stage of the OPP. The logistical estimate process uses the 4 Ds: demand, distance, duration, and destination. Demand identifies the forecasted quantity and pattern of consumption or usage of material and services. Demand will be driven by the following factors, as, for example, nature and size of the force and tempo and intensity of operations. Distance. The expected duration of the operation will impact the logistic plan. The duration of the logistic plan should be coherent with the operation plan chronology. Shorter operations will be able to make maximum use of temporary and deployable infrastructure and rely on small stock holdings. Duration. The expected duration of the operation will impact the logistic plan also. The duration of the logistic plan should be coherent with the operation plan chronology. Destination. To understand the impact of the destination on the logistic operation, this can be, for example, available logistic nodes, host nation support, capabilities and capacity, and climate and terrain. Shorter operations will be able to make maximum use of temporary and deployable infrastructure and rely on small stock holdings. The Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, DSACURE, coordinates troop contributions, the Force Generation. Force Generation process is the procedure by which allies and partner countries resource the personnel and equipment needed to carry out North Atlantic Council approved operations and missions. NATO relies on the military forces of its member countries to carry out an operation or mission because it does not possess military forces of its own. Personnel serving in a NATO operation are referred to as NATO forces, but are multinational forces from NATO countries and, in some cases, partner or other troop contributing countries. National capitals take the final decision on whether to contribute to a NATO-led operation or mission. Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe can only ask the NATO member countries and partner countries for military forces, not task. The NATO Force Generation process is synchronized and conducted together with the NATO Operational Planning Process, Phase 2 to 4. We have in this presentation introduced you to the NATO Operational Planning Process, the NATO Crisis Management Methodology with its 6 phases, 2 planning categories, Advanced and Crisis Response Planning. Operational Planning Process is the planning on military strategic and operational level. Joint Operational Planning Group is responsible for the operational planning process. Logistic Operational Planning Group supports the Joint Operational Planning Group when needed. NATO Force Generation process is synchronized and conducted together with the operational planning process. Key takeaway: the NATO planning process encourages concurrency of planning efforts at all levels and is commander-driven. Progression throughout each phase in NATO crisis management process is not automatic and will be guided by the North Atlantic decision-making. Thank you for following this presentation.